Welcome. In this explainer, we're going to take a systematic look at the adrenal cortex. We'll break down its structure, the hormones it produces, and the critical roles they play throughout the body.
So here's our plan. We'll start with a general overview of the adrenal gland, then take a journey through the layers of the cortex. After that, we'll get to know the corticosteroid hormone family, see how they're made and how they travel, and finally, we'll look at what happens to them once their job is done. All right, first things first, let's get our bearings and talk about where the adrenal glands are and what they're made of. So you have two of these adrenal glands, and they're pretty small. Each one weighs only about 4 grams. They sit right on top of your kidneys, kind of like little hats. But don't let their size fool you. Their impact on your physiology is absolutely massive. Now, what's fascinating is that the adrenal gland is really 2 glands in one. You have the central part, the adrenal medulla, which comes from the nervous system and pumps out hormones like epinephrine. But our focus today is on the outer part, the adrenal cortex. It makes up about 80% of the gland's total mass, and its job is to produce a whole class of steroid hormones called corticosteroids. Okay, so let's zoom in on the cortex itself. You see, it's not just one uniform block of tissue. It's actually organized into 3 very distinct, very functional layers or zones. If you were to travel from the outside of the gland inward, the very first layer you'd hit is the zona glomerulosa. Go a little deeper, and you're in the middle and largest layer, the zona fasciculata. And finally, the deepest layer, right next to the medulla, is the zona reticularis. And as we'll see, each layer has a very specific job. And this table really illustrates a core concept in physiology. Structure dictates function. The outer zona glomerulosa, making up just 15% of the cortex, is where aldosterone is made, and its release is controlled by things like angiotensin II and potassium levels. Then you have the huge middle layer, the zona fasciculata, which makes cortisol, and it's controlled by ACTH from the pituitary gland. And that same hormone, ACTH, also controls the innermost zona reticularis, which is mainly responsible for producing androgens. Now here's a crucial point. All these different hormones we've mentioned, aldosterone, cortisol, the androgens, they all belong to one single chemical family. They're all corticosteroids. And we can sort them into 3 main groups based on what they do. These 3 categories really sum up what the adrenal cortex is all about. First, you've got the mineralocorticoids, which, as the name suggests, manage the body's minerals or electrolytes and water balance. Second, there are the glucocorticoids, which are essential for regulating blood sugar and overall metabolism. And third, we have the androgenic hormones, which are basically sex hormones. When it comes to mineralocorticoid activity, aldosterone is really the star of the show. While a few other steroids can do a similar job to a small degree, aldosterone is so powerful that it accounts for about 90% of the total effort in regulating the body's salt and water balance. And we see a very similar story with the glucocorticoids. The main player here is cortisol. It's so dominant that it's responsible for about 95% of all glucocorticoid activity in the body. It's absolutely vital for managing glucose and our response to stress. This chart highlights a really important concept in medicine. We can use cortisol as our baseline, our standard for potency. But you can see that synthetic versions have been developed that are way more powerful. Prednisone, for example, a common anti-inflammatory drug, is 4 times stronger than our own cortisol. And then you have dexamethasone, which is an incredible 30 times more potent. So, we know what these hormones are and what they do, but how are they actually made? Let's take a look at the factory floor, so to speak, and then see how they get transported from the adrenal gland to the rest of the body.
You know, despite all their different functions, every single corticosteroid starts out as the exact same molecule, cholesterol. Most of this cholesterol isn't made in the gland itself. It's pulled from the bloodstream, mostly from LDLs, or low-density lipoproteins.
The entire production line for all of these hormones is controlled by one single, very important first step, and that's the conversion of cholesterol into a molecule called pregnenolone. We call this the rate-limiting step because the speed of this reaction sets the pace for everything else that follows. So when hormones like ACTH need to ramp up production, this is the step they target.
Now, how a hormone travels in the blood has a huge impact on how long it sticks around. Take cortisol. About 90 to 95% of it is bound to transport proteins. This protects it from being broken down, which gives it a long half-life. Aldosterone, on the other hand, is a different story. About 40% of it floats around freely in the blood. This means it's ready for action, but it also means it gets cleared out really fast, giving it a half-life of only about 20 minutes.
All right, last section. What happens after these hormones have done their job and delivered their message? Let's follow them on their final journey, from being metabolized to being excreted from the body. The main processing plant for used steroid hormones is the liver. In the liver, they go through a process called conjugation. Essentially, a molecule gets attached to the steroid, usually glucuronic acid, and this is a critical step. It transforms the hormone from being fat-soluble to water-soluble, which is necessary so the body can easily get rid of it. So once the liver makes them water-soluble, these hormone byproducts have two main ways out. About a quarter of them get excreted into the bile and leave through the digestive system, but the vast majority, the other 75%, go back into the bloodstream, get filtered by the kidneys, and are finally removed from the body in the urine. This table shows us some really interesting numbers. If you look at the plasma concentration, you'll see there's roughly twice as much cortisol floating around as there is aldosterone. But the really big difference is in the daily secretion rate. We make 15 to 20 milligrams of cortisol every day, but only about 150 micrograms of aldosterone. This just goes to show how incredibly potent aldosterone is. You only need a tiny amount to get a huge physiological effect. And that leads us to a final thought. We've gone through the normal, healthy function of the adrenal cortex and its different zones. So the natural next question, especially from a clinical perspective, is this. What would happen if one of these zones stopped working? What if the zona glomerulosa couldn't make aldosterone, or the zona fascicula couldn't make cortisol? Once you understand the normal function, you can start to predict the consequences when things go wrong.
All right, let's talk about the adrenal cortex. Think of this little gland sitting right on top of your kidneys as a super important hormone factory. It's working around the clock to produce hormones that are absolutely essential for life. They control everything from your blood pressure to how your body handles stress. So today, we're going to dive into the amazing physiology of this vital little organ.
So, here's our game plan. We'll start with a quick overview of the adrenal cortex itself. Then we'll get into the details of aldosterone, our body's salt manager. We'll look at what happens when its levels get out of whack. After that, we're on to cortisol, the famous stress and sugar manager. And to wrap it all up, we'll see how the body keeps these powerful hormones under tight control.
Okay, so our journey begins in the very outer layer of the adrenal cortex, a zone called the zona glomerulosa. Now, this area is special because it's the only place in the body that makes a class of hormones called mineralocorticoids. And just like their name suggests, they are all about regulating the body's mineral balance.
So what exactly do mineralocorticoids do? Well, their main job is to keep our electrolytes, like sodium and potassium, and our fluid levels perfectly balanced. And when we talk about mineralocorticoids, we're really talking about one key player, aldosterone. It's the star of the show, responsible for about 90% of all mineralocorticoid activity. Let's take a closer look at what it does.
Think of aldosterone as the body's master salt manager. Its job is to meticulously fine-tune the balance of sodium and potassium. And getting this balance right is absolutely critical, not just for our cells to function properly, but for our very survival.
So, aldosterone's main workplace is in the kidneys, specifically in the distal tubules and collecting ducts. What it does there is pretty clever. It tells the kidney cells to pull sodium out of the urine and back into the blood. But there's a trade. In exchange for that sodium, it pushes potassium out of the blood and into the urine to be excreted. Now, here's a key piece of the puzzle. Water loves to follow sodium. So as sodium is reabsorbed, water follows right along with it, which increases our overall fluid volume and blood pressure. And interestingly, even though we're holding on to more sodium, its concentration in the blood doesn't really change much because we're holding on to that extra water too.
And aldosterone's job doesn't stop at the kidneys. It's also active in our sweat glands, our salivary glands, and even the lining of our intestines. In all these places, it does the same thing. It helps reabsorb sodium. This is super important for conserving salt when we're sweating in hot weather and for preventing too much fluid loss through our gut. So how does this tiny hormone actually make all this happen at a cellular level? Well, because aldosterone is a steroid, it's lipid-soluble, meaning it can just slip right through the cell membrane. Once inside, it binds to its specific receptor in the cytoplasm. This new hormone receptor team then travels into the cell's nucleus, finds the right spot on the DNA, and basically tells it to start making new proteins. These new proteins are the transport channels and pumps, like the sodium-potassium pump, that actually do the work of moving the ions around. It's a really elegant system.
Okay, so we've seen how vital aldosterone is. It should come as no surprise that if this delicate balance gets disrupted, if you have too much or too little, it can cause some really serious problems for the body. Let's explore what happens when things go wrong. This slide really lays it out clearly. If you have too much aldosterone, a condition called hyperaldosteronism, your body holds on to way too much salt and water, which leads to high blood pressure. It also gets rid of too much potassium, causing low potassium levels or hypokalemia, which can make your muscles weak. On the flip side, if you don't have enough aldosterone, that's hypoaldosteronism, your body wastes salt, leading to dehydration. Potassium levels build up to dangerous highs, a condition called hyperkalemia, which can be toxic to the heart and can even lead to circulatory collapse.
Now, to really appreciate just how specialized aldosterone is, let's compare it to cortisol. In terms of managing minerals, aldosterone is about 3,000 times more powerful than cortisol. Even though there's way more cortisol floating around in our blood, its effect on our salt balance is pretty minimal under normal circumstances. This really makes aldosterone the undisputed champion of electrolyte balance.
All right, let's switch gears and talk about the other major player from the adrenal cortex, cortisol. If you think of aldosterone as the salt manager, then cortisol is definitely the stress and sugar manager. Its main job is to completely shift our metabolism to help us deal with all kinds of pressure.
And just like aldosterone dominates its category, cortisol is the absolute king of the glucocorticoids. It's responsible for about 95% of all glucocorticoid activity in the entire body. When we talk about glucocorticoids, we're pretty much talking about cortisol.
So one of cortisol's most important metabolic jobs is to fire up a process in the liver called gluconeogenesis. This is just a fancy way of saying making new glucose. Cortisol tells the liver to take things that aren't carbs, mainly amino acids from our muscles, and turn them into sugar. It can crank up this process by 6 to 10 times the normal rate. This is incredibly important for making sure our brain has a steady supply of energy during stress or when we're fasting.
Now, this is where cortisol's effect gets really interesting. It has this kind of split personality when it comes to protein. Out in the body, in your muscles, for example, it hits the brakes on building new protein and actually starts breaking existing protein down. This frees up those amino acids we just talked about. But once those amino acids get to the liver, cortisol does the complete opposite. It ramps up protein synthesis in the liver to produce essential things like plasma proteins. So you get this strange situation where excess cortisol can lead to muscle weakness even while the liver is working overtime.
Cortisol also gets involved in fat metabolism. It encourages fat cells to release fatty acids into the bloodstream, making them available as another energy source. But when you have too much cortisol for too long, a very peculiar and characteristic thing starts to happen with how your body stores fat.
And that peculiar thing is this: the fat gets redistributed. This leads to what clinicians call a moon face, where the face becomes rounder, and sometimes a buffalo hump, which is a pad of fat on the upper back. These aren't just random changes. They are the classic telltale signs of a condition called Cushing Syndrome, which is caused by having way too much cortisol.
So what triggers the release of all this cortisol? Well, pretty much any kind of stress you can imagine. We're talking about physical stress, like an injury, an infection, or even surgery. Environmental stress, like extreme heat or cold, counts too. And of course, there's also psychological stress, which makes cortisol a hugely important hormone in our often stressful modern lives.
Now, given how incredibly powerful both of these hormones are, you can bet the body has to keep their release under very tight control. So for our final section, let's look at the elegant feedback systems the body uses to regulate aldosterone and cortisol.
Okay, let's break down who's in charge of aldosterone secretion. As you can see from this table, there are two really big, potent drivers. The first is an increase in potassium in the blood. The second is a hormone called angiotensin II, which is a major player in regulating blood pressure. Those are the two big ones. On the other side, an increase in sodium can slightly decrease aldosterone, but it's a pretty weak signal. And you might be wondering about ACTH, the main hormone that controls cortisol. Well, it has a little bit of a stimulating effect, but it's really minor and doesn't last long.
So when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway? The adrenal cortex is essentially a master tuner for our body's internal environment. Through the actions of aldosterone and cortisol, it's constantly making tiny adjustments, balancing our fluids, our electrolytes, and our energy, all to help us adapt and survive in a constantly changing world. And that brings us to a final, thought-provoking question for you to consider. We've learned that cortisol is our main stress hormone, and we also know it can have some weak aldosterone-like effects. So with that in mind, how do you think chronic stress, which keeps cortisol levels high all the time, might interfere with that delicate salt and water balance that is normally the sole responsibility of aldosterone? It's an interesting connection to think about. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.
Hello and welcome. Today we're diving deep into the essential hormones of the adrenal cortex. We're going to break down their physiology and, importantly, their clinical relevance in a really clear, structured way. So if you're a student of medicine or physiology, this explainer is definitely for you. Here's our game plan. First up, we'll explore cortisol's main job, controlling inflammation. Then we'll look at the incredible control system known as the HPA axis. After that, we'll get into cortisol's 24-hour cycle, its connection to other hormones, and finally, we'll see what happens when this whole elegant system goes wrong.
All right, so let's kick things off with what is arguably a cortisol's most vital function. I'm talking about its powerful ability to act as the body's own natural brake on inflammation.
You know, inflammation is a necessary and protective response, but it is a real double-edged sword. If it's not kept in check, the inflammation itself can become destructive, causing even more harm than whatever started the problem. And that's exactly where cortisol steps in to preserve our tissues.
So how does cortisol pull this off? Well, it has a multi-pronged attack. It stabilizes these tiny sacs called lysosomes, stopping them from spilling destructive enzymes all over the place. It tells white blood cells to stay put, so they don't rush to the area. It also suppresses key immune players like T lymphocytes and dials down the numbers of other cells like eosinophils. It's this comprehensive approach that makes it such a potent anti-inflammatory agent.
Okay, so if cortisol is that powerful, the body must have a way to control it, right? Absolutely. The answer is this really elegant control system called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or as we'll call it, the HPA axis.
The key player, the central messenger in this whole system, is adrenal corticotropic hormone, or ACTH. It's sent out from the anterior pituitary, and its job is simple. It's the signal that tells the adrenal cortex, hey, time to make some cortisone.
Let's walk through this cascade step by step. It all starts with some kind of stress. That makes the hypothalamus release a hormone called CRH. CRH then travels to the pituitary and tells it to release ACTH. Then ACTH travels to the adrenal cortex and says, release cortisol. But here's the brilliant part, that cortisol then travels back to the brain and tells both the hypothalamus and pituitary to quiet down. It's a classic negative feedback loop that keeps everything in balance.
But there's a critical exception to this rule. During periods of really severe stress, think major injury or illness, that initial go signal from the brain is so powerful that it can actually override the negative feedback. This makes sure the body gets a sustained supply of cortisol to handle the crisis.
Now, the HPA axis doesn't just kick in during stress. It's also running constantly in the background, following a built-in 24-hour clock. This brings us to the circadian rhythm of cortisol.
As you can see pretty clearly on this chart, cortisol levels are not flat throughout the day. They hit a major peak in the early morning, around 20 micrograms or 100 milliliters, which helps get us up and going. Then, they steadily drop all day, hitting their lowest point, down around 5 micrograms, right around midnight.
And this daily rhythm isn't just a fun fact, it's clinically super important. A cortisol level that's perfectly normal at 8 a.m. could be a sign of a serious problem if you saw it at midnight. So clinicians always have to take the time of day into account when they're looking at lab results.
The story of ACTH and cortisol is actually part of a much bigger hormonal family. It turns out, when the body makes ACTH, it's making a whole suite of other related hormones at the same time, all from a common source. And that common source is a giant precursor molecule called pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. You can think of POMC as a big slab of protein that gets synthesized in the pituitary. The body then cleaves it, or cuts it up, into several smaller active hormones. And yep, ACTH is just one of those pieces.
So, whenever the pituitary is told to make ACTH, it's really making POMC. And from that one precursor, we also get melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH, which deals with skin pigmentation, lipotrophin, which is involved in fat metabolism, and even endorphins, the body's natural painkillers. They all get released together.
Now, this shared origin has a really important clinical consequence. Because ACTH is structurally pretty similar to MSH, if you have super high levels of ACTH, it can actually start to stimulate the skin's melanocytes. The result is a darkening of the skin, or hyperpigmentation. Remember that, because we're going to see why it matters in just a bit.
And just to complete the picture, let's briefly touch on the last group of hormones from the adrenal cortex, the adrenal androgens. These are male sex hormones that, particularly in females, play a role in growing axillary and pubic hair. Now, let's shift gears and see what happens when the regulation of all these adrenal hormones goes off the rails.
All right, this is where we get to apply all this physiology to the real world. We're going to see what happens when this intricate control system fails by comparing two classic endocrine disorders, Addison's disease, which is hypoadrenalism, and Cushing syndrome, which is hyperadrenalism.
This table really breaks it down nicely. Addison's disease is all about insufficiency. Not enough cortisol, usually because the body's own immune system has attacked the adrenal cortex. Cushing syndrome is the opposite. It's a state of excess cortisol. Now look at the key symptoms for Addison's: low sodium, high potassium, low blood sugar, and there it is, the hyperpigmentation we talked about. And notice how incredibly sensitive to stress these patients are.
And here's where it all connects back to our HPA axis. In Addison's disease, the adrenal glands have failed. There's no cortisol being made, so there's no negative feedback telling the pituitary to stop. What does the pituitary do? It panics and starts pumping out massive amounts of ACTH to try and get the adrenals to respond. It's this huge flood of ACTH that causes that skin darkening. On the flip side, a specific cause of hyperadrenalism, known as Cushing's disease, is actually a pituitary tumor that's just churning out way too much ACTH on its own.
So, to wrap this all up, I want to leave you with this question to think about. How does a solid understanding of the HPA axis, its cascade, its crucial feedback loops, and all those related hormones, how does that knowledge become the fundamental tool that allows us to predict and diagnose the very different and often opposite signs we see in adrenal problems? It really is the key to it all.
Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the body's incredible response to stress, and we'll be focusing on the star of the show, the one hormone that really orchestrates the whole thing, cortisol.
So, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off by defining what the stress response really is. Then, we'll trace the fascinating hormonal chain reaction that releases cortisol. We'll explore what cortisol actually does, how our body keeps it in check, and what happens when that system goes wrong. Finally, we'll wrap it all up by looking at its critical balancing act.
All right, so first things first. When we talk about stress from a physiological point of view, what are we really talking about?
Well, you can think of stress as the body's master plan for dealing with any kind of threat. And it doesn't matter if that threat is physical, like an injury, or psychological, like a looming deadline. The goal is always the same, to keep our internal world stable and balanced, a state that scientists call homeostasis. It's a huge, coordinated effort between our nervous and endocrine systems.
Okay, so how does the body actually launch this hormonal response? It all comes down to a central command system. We call it the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or just the HPA axis for short.
The best way to understand this is as a three-step chain of command. It all starts in the brain. The hypothalamus spots a threat and sends out the first signal, a hormone called CRH. That signal travels just a tiny distance to its neighbor, the pituitary gland. The pituitary gets the message and releases its own hormone, ACTH, which gets dumped into the bloodstream. From there, ACTH travels all the way down to the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys, and gives the final order, release the cortisol.
And that brings us to cortisol itself. It's the end product of this whole cascade, and it's really the body's #1 agent for dealing with stress.
And this really says it all. Cortisol isn't just some minor player in the game, it is absolutely essential for our survival. Without it, our body just couldn't handle even a simple infection or a minor injury. It's that important.
So what does cortisol do to get the body ready for action? Well, its main job, its metabolic mission, is to make energy available, and fast. It signals the liver to start making new glucose, it breaks down proteins from your muscles into amino acids that can be used for fuel, it frees up fatty acids from your fat stores, and here's the really clever part, it acts as an insulin antagonist. It basically tells most of your body cells, hey, don't use this glucose. Why? To save all that precious fuel for the single most important organ in a crisis, your brain.
But it's not just about energy. Cortisol provides critical support across your entire system. It helps keep your blood pressure up by making your blood vessels more responsive to adrenaline. It's also a powerful anti-inflammatory, which is crucial for preventing the immune system from going overboard right away. And in your brain, it cranks up your alertness and sharpens your focus, getting you ready to face whatever is coming.
And this is where we get to the core paradox of cortisol. It's a classic double-edged sword. All those things that are absolutely life-saving in a short-term crisis become incredibly destructive if they go on for too long. The energy mobilization that saves you can lead to chronic high blood sugar. The inflammation control that protects you can turn into a suppressed immune system. That laser focus can become anxiety, depression, and memory problems. This system was built for a sprint, not a marathon.
So that begs the question, right? If having high cortisol all the time is so bad for us, how does the body keep it all under control? Let's look at how the system regulates itself.
The main control system is a really elegant process called a negative feedback loop. You can think of it just like the thermostat in your house. When the cortisol level in your blood, the temperature, gets high enough, the cortisol itself sends a signal back to the brain. It tells both the hypothalamus and the pituitary, okay, that's enough. You can stop sending the signals. This shuts down the whole production line, keeping the levels from getting out of control. On top of that feedback loop, cortisol also follows a natural 24-hour cycle, what we call a circadian rhythm. Your levels are naturally highest in the early morning. That's part of what helps you wake up and feel alert. Then throughout the day, they gradually drop, hitting their lowest point in the middle of the night while you're in a deep sleep. And this predictable rhythm is super important in medicine because a doctor has to know what time of day your blood was drawn to properly interpret your cortisol levels.
So what happens when this carefully balanced system breaks down? Let's take a look at the clinical side of things. What happens when you have way too little or way too much cortisol? You end up with two very different and very serious conditions. On one side, if you don't have enough cortisol, that's called Addison's disease. A person with Addison's can't maintain their blood sugar or blood pressure properly, and they become extremely vulnerable. Even a minor infection could cause a life-threatening collapse. On the flip side, with too much cortisol, you have Cushing Syndrome. This is where all those chronic long-term effects take over.
You get high blood sugar, weakening of muscles and bones, a suppressed immune system, and even noticeable changes in mood and physical appearance.
Okay, so let's bring it all home. Let's summarize everything and look at cortisol's total integrated role in helping us adapt to stress.
I think this cable provides a fantastic overview. The key takeaway here is that cortisol is an integrator. It doesn't just do one thing. It's conducting an orchestra. It manages your metabolism to provide the fuel, supports your cardiovascular system to deliver that fuel, keeps your immune system in check, and tunes up your nervous system for peak performance, all while managing its own production through that beautiful feedback loop.
And that leaves us with one final, really important question to think about. This entire amazing system evolved over millions of years to deal with short-term physical threats, running from a predator, fighting an infection. The question for all of us today is how well does that ancient system cope with the kind of stress we face now, the constant, chronic, psychological pressures of modern life? It's something worth reflecting on. Thanks for watching.